We should talk about the book, but
please.
but I want to ask you about your just written a book focused around the U.S. presidency and the remarks that people make from that lofty position.
Yes.
And we're in the midst of a campaign. We're in the campaign year.
Yeah. Yep.
The Supreme Court is going to hear challenges to the Colorado disqualification of Trump from the primary ballot based on the fact that he supported insurrection, interpreting the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which I'm sure you're intimately familiar with. What do you make of that? I have taken the position, I'll just say for the record, that I don't know from the 14th Amendment. I'm not going to claim to be a historian or a constitutional lawyer. I can see that there'd be arguments. But what seems very clear to me is that if you disqualify Donald Trump from participation in the 2024 election based upon that, you're making a grave mistake in terms of the legitimacy of our institutions. It's not just that you're giving ammunition to Trump, to trumpet that he's being a victim. You're basically telling the electorate that the Democrats are going to continue to govern the country and that, the strongest opponent to their program is not going to be allowed to stand. And that strikes me as a disaster for the country. Please tell me where I'm wrong.
All right. Let me say that some of what I say may be in the devil's advocate role, which you enjoy so much yourself. But actually, my blog, where I try to post every week, is called historyunfolding.com. I blogged about this, and I did so with the help of a short article about the history of that clause, which was very, very good, and explained how that clause was applied after the Civil War, as it was. And what the clause said was that anybody who had first taken an oath to support the Constitution, and who had then participated in an insurrection, was ineligible to hold any federal or state office. End of story. And they could only be relieved of that disability by a 2/3 vote in Congress, which in fact is what happened in 1872, only a few years later, when almost all the former Confederates were pardoned, in effect, by 2/3 majority of Congress. It was a big step towards the end of Reconstruction. But meanwhile, they had all accepted that, and they identified 6 or 7 cases where people had tried to take some office who had been part of the rebellion, and they were disallowed from doing so by state courts or by federal courts, or in one case by a state official. And they did not have to be convicted of insurrection, you see, because disqualification from office isn't a criminal punishment. So what I said in the blog is the originalists on the Supreme Court are going to have a problem with this case, because what the Colorado court did and what the official in Maine did is totally within the precedent of what was done after the Civil War. Now, here's the problem. The circumstances matter. There wasn't any doubt at the time of the passage of the 14th Amendment that we had had a huge insurrection, and there wasn't any doubt who had been part of it. I mean, anybody who served in the Confederate Army is the Confederate government, obviously. It was a prima facie case. Things aren't quite as clear now, obviously. Plus, nobody could deny, even if you were sad the South lost or whatever, that there had been this war and that they had lost. Okay, so that was straightforward. Now today, that's not so straightforward, because we don't have the same political consensus about what had happened and who won and who turned out to be an insurrectionist, because they lost instead of a freedom fighter if they had won. Now, this is all part of the collapse of our institutions, which I talked about in the latter stages of the book in connection with the election of Trump. Trump was a total outsider, and in 2016, neither political party could come up with somebody who could beat him. That showed that our political order was in a state of collapse. And in some ways that's continued, in some ways it's gotten worse. The great tragedy was that Mitch McConnell, in January of 2021, lost his nerve, was not willing to rally enough Republican senators, as I'm sure he could have, to convict Trump in the second impeachment trial, which would have ruled him out as a candidate for all time.
And you think he should have been defeated?
Of course. I think he should have been convicted. And yes, he was clearly guilty. He should have been convicted. And we would have been through with that. But they didn't do that.
I'm sorry to interrupt. What was he guilty of that ought to have been ratified by the second impeachment? What was he guilty of?
He was guilty of illegally trying to overturn the results of the election, including the incitement of the insurrection. And if that isn't a high crime or misdemeanor, I don't know what is. And remember, a majority of the Senate agreed with that. That's not a trivial fact, even though you need 2/3 of the Senate to convict.
Again, forgive my naivete, and I maybe expose myself to certain kind of criticisms. But what were the high crimes and misdemeanors of which Trump was guilty in his resistance to ratification of the November 2020
the attempt in many ways to overturn the result of the election in about half a dozen states, and to get Mike Pence to take an unconstitutional step to refuse to certify the results of the election, and the incitement of the mob to go into the Capitol and try to intimidate the Congress or whatever into doing his bidding.
Peacefully and patriotically assemble.
That didn't look to me to be peaceful.
But those were his words. He didn't say go down there and make a ruckus of things.
He used words like fight and whatever. I mean, I haven't prepared the full bill of particulars here, but I think what he wanted was clear enough.
So,
also, his reaction to it when it happened made that clear. His long delay in making any statement.